The island of Portland provides one of the most dramatic coastlines in England. A block of limestone, tethered to the mainland only by the mighty Chesil Bank. Its historic isolation and unique character make this story all the more remarkable.
Pleased to meet you, Stuart. Phew, that was some steep climb.
Yes, I used to get up there very much quicker when I was a boy. This is a superb vantage point to see some of the features of Church Ope.
Have you always lived on the island?
Yes, apart from a short spell in the 1960s, yes I have. I was born here.
You've written books about Portland. And what's your connection with the island?
Well, I have family connections going back generations, if not centuries, in fact, particularly on my paternal grandmother's side. She was born and bred on Portland, and so were her forebears, and it was her that gave me a lot of the information and enthusiasm for the history of the place and the general environment of Portland.
In ancient times, for the defence of the island against attack, taxes were raised to build the first castle of any significance here. It was built on a pinnacle of rock, high above Church Ope Cove, on the site of an earlier Saxon defence work. The workmanship displayed in the close-cut stone shows that the art of quarrying and masonry had been well mastered by the 14th century.
Well, Rufus Castle here is in a fairly sorry state at the moment. It's survived on this site, obviously, for upwards of 600 years, and yet we've seen some pretty serious damage occurring just in the recent times. And English Heritage are proposing to do a restoration, or at least a consolidation scheme on it, and I would say not before time.
Every age has left its mark. Portland's recorded history goes back 1,500 years, but excavation work has given us tantalizing glimpses of far earlier inhabitants. Until the 19th century, instead of the great array of quarries you see now, the plateau of Top Hill was an expanse of fields. There were a few tiny watercourses running through depressions, too shallow to be called valleys, towards the English Channel beyond. These watering places attracted the first settlements, and Portland has among the most positive evidence of the presence of Stone Age man to be found in England. And while there are a few traces of Paleolithic man, there is much more evidence of the Middle Stone Age, where an enormous amount of material has been found at Culverwell, at the Mesolithic site near Portland Bill.
It is, in fact, the only site known in England where we can get a complete picture about how people of the Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age really lived. How they were the beginning of all these people who started villages, who started farming, who started all these lovely villages on the island and elsewhere. So that we can see here almost in embryonic form the beginning of settlement. Not only on the island, I should stress that, Calverwell is of international importance. And I regard that as the greatest achievement of my 33 years of working here.
Within the museum we have a number of artifacts which show that man has been living continuously on the island since those early days. We have iron ingots. These are fairly unique and were probably used as currency during that age. There is also evidence of a fairly large Romano-British occupation on the island. This is indicated with the skulls, the amount of burnished black Roman pottery which we have, and the numbers of red glazed dishes and Samianware dishes.
It was probably the Romans who built the first ponds and wells from the springs on the steep hillside. Round these wells, first real hamlets grew, their names having been passed down to us like Fortune's Well and Maidenwell, along with Malham's and Chisel. These small hamlets, for centuries separate communities, blended into the dense array of the buildings below during the great influx of the 19th century. The early villages at Top Hill also grew around natural water sources, such as Wakeham, Reform, Weston and Southwell. After the Romans withdrew in the 4th century, the south coast fell to the Saxon Raiders. These new settlers introduced a revolutionary agricultural village system, which was to shape the Portland landscape and affect its life right up to modern times. It was the Saxons who established the Manor of Portland, with the King of Wessex as its lord. They had a more lasting effect on Portland's customary life than any other regime. To govern all local affairs, manorial courts were established. The courts, leet and baron as they became known, were set up throughout the land. This court leet was a direct link between the people and the crown, as this was a royal manor. Portlanders never answered to barons or earls. Their status was indeed special, and the Portlanders knew it. William II introduced a local land tax to help fund the building of defences, including Church Ope. The amount was raised by the king every year from tenants of the manor. In return, this quit the inhabitants from liability for service to the lord, and was always known as the quit rent. The reeve, a local landowner, would collect the quit rent around the island, recording payments by notches on his reeve staff. This continued right up until 1935. The ancient court leet has survived uniquely, with legal powers to this day. One colourful duty of the court leet is to beat the bounds every 7 years, some 4 miles along Chesil Beach.
Believe your only Son, Jesus Christ, has ascended into the heavens. We pray that we also in heart and mind may also ascend, that we may come to dwell with him in all eternity. For he lives with you.
The boundary stone marks the only point where the royal manor of Portland touches the mainland, and it is here where this ceremony is still carried out. Farming and fishing through the Middle Ages were the staple industries for the people of Portland right up to modern times. One time, No less than 900 sheep of a special breed grazed the islands, and these became a prized commodity. Portland mutton was regarded as the best in the land and graced many a royal table. Small flocks of this rare breed can still be seen around the island. Corn and other crops were harvested in the shallow but productive soil right across Top Hill. Grain was taken to the two windmills on high ground between Wakeham and Weston. Right until the 20th century, the Top Hill landscape was pastoral, as yet untouched by the quarries, which were still confined to around the coast. This must be one of the most romantic settings on the island. The ancient church, which gave Church Ope its name, was the main meeting place for islanders for 500 years. The old church was rebuilt about 1300, with a bell tower curiously separated from the main building by a 1-metre gap. For centuries, France was the country's enemy. Portland bore the brunt of numerous raids and skirmishes from across the Channel, as in the spring of 1404, when the French swept Portland with fire installed, damaging the old church so badly that it had to be rebuilt. It was then rededicated to St Andrew in 1475. By the early 16th century, the sheltered waters of Portland roads provided vital refuge for the navy and merchantmen. But they were plagued by French privateers and other pirates.
Captain of the guard, fire!
Around 1538, Henry VIII ordered the building of Portland Castle, which displays the impeccable work of the Tudor masons and the lesser-known skill of the quarry selectors. Today, Portland Castle remains in remarkable condition for its 4.5 centuries. Before the castle was 50 years old, the attention turned to the growing menace from Spain. The Armada was expected, and in 1588, the castle was stocked up with ordnance and men. The ensuing Battle of Portland in July of that year, one of the great engagements between the Spanish Armada and the English fleet, was witnessed by Portlanders lining the cliff tops. The battle itself may not have been decisive, but it stands in the annals of British history.
Jo called me over and said she was interested in this Elizabethan thing that they were going to do out of the castle, and was I interested in doing any sewing? So I said yes, and that's how it started, and I really got in at the deep end. We'd no materials, we'd no patterns, we'd no pictures, we'd nothing. So we had to go scouting round, trying to find ideas. We got a pair of old curtains given to us, and we used those to make this. Do you remember?
Yep.
They'd been turned down at a jumble sale. I think we made about 8 or 9 outfits altogether. Men's and ladies, hats and children's.
How goes the game?
Stalemate, my lord.
Sounds more like our cooks cooking than playing a game.
Yes, my lord.
The English Civil War demonstrated Portland's outstanding loyalty to the Crown, when the royal manor and its castle were taken and retaken by the Roundheads, and, as a consequence, Portland suffered tremendous damage. Treatment by Cromwell's troops was harsh. Among the buildings they destroyed was what had been far and away the island's finest building, which stood on this site, the Vicar's House at Wakeham, where a priceless library of manuscripts was burned. For their loyalty, when Charles II was restored to the throne, Portlanders were given special privileges and a grant of money for every ton of stone taken from Crown lands. This royal grant fund has been renewed by monarchs to this day. Through this time, stone quarrying was nibbling away at the cliff edges, but it was not yet the major industry it was to become. An event far away in London in 1619 was to change the island's fortunes, and indeed its shape, forever. That was the year that the old banqueting house was burnt down. Inigo Jones, the royal surveyor, selected Portland stone for use on the new building, and the 3-year contract that followed paid for new roads and stone shipping piers under East Weirs. Jones's masterpiece proved the worth of Portland stone as the perfect building material for the capital. And when, 45 years later, Christopher Wren was commissioned to rebuild St. Paul's Cathedral after the Great Fire of London, his choice of Portland stone was perhaps inevitable. That great project and the building of the other 50 Wren churches around London involved a massive effort and undertaking on this small island. Without Portlanders' expertise and cooperation, the cathedral could not have been completed. The island's major stone industry was now well and truly established. But winning stone away from the cliffs was becoming increasingly difficult. The problem of disposing of the waste became acute. Tracks and cuttings were made, and the overburden was trucked to the cliff edge. Retired quarrymen still take pride in explaining the old methods to Portland's many visitors.
If the stone is tight up under the other rock, you can't cut it. You see, it won't cut. But this is how you do it. You might have 5 men through like that, all strike in unison. And you notice there's 4 wedges in there. Well, you've got to free a wedge every time, so you strike 3. 2, 3, and free that one. Well, then when that one's free, you take him out. You've got the weight line on these. You put a small piece of iron up under there, which is called a rail. And it goes in so that the rail is there. It'd be further out than the others. So then you free the next one. And you free that, free that. That's how you do it. So you've lifted up perhaps 100 ton, maybe more.
Now that's L.B. Bush's quarry mile. That's the last quarry he worked in. XL. A.B. L.B. Bush. My father started about 1925 at Wakeham, and I started working with him straight after the war. That is called a Twy-bell, and they used to put the lifting pit in with that. When after they got the lifting pit in, they used to put the big wedges, which was always supplied by the local blacksmith.
Of course, the eventual arrival of steam power and mechanisation freed quarries of all constraints and enabled them to gorge inland, so removing field after historic field, giving the landscape we see today. Through the ages, Portlanders have made a living from the sea.
fishing at Chesil Cove or Castletown or Church Oak need an intricate knowledge and respect of local waters.
The sea around Portland Bill has long been regarded as one of the greatest navigational hazards in the Channel. Tide and currents clash as they round the point, creating a treacherous race that can run at 10 knots in spring tidal conditions.
The Romans probably lit fires on Branscombe Hill to warn the sailors of the dangers, but lack of any local fuel would have meant these warning beacons would have been few and far between. Shipwrecks were...
Another familiar site of long standing was HMS Boscawen, which served as a training ship for boys entering the Navy. From as long ago as George III, royal visitors would frequent the island. In 1932, King George V came aboard the royal yacht for a review of the fleet.
I've always lived on the island. I was born during the middle part of the First World War, when of course the British Navy was at the peak of its height. So on this small island, we've always been used to seeing ships all around us. It was quite common practice in those days to see whole ships' companies being marched around the island, headed by a Royal Marine Band. It wasn't surprising when the Second World War came that I joined the Navy, and I spent the entire war in small ships.
For 4 decades, Portland held an outstanding record for sea training. Undoubtedly, it became one of the finest maritime training schools of all time. Naval exercises were a common occurrence, where crews were trained to the highest degree in skills and competence to face any emergency or wartime situation. They were supported by a highly skilled civilian technical workforce, providing ship-to-shore resources, replenishment of ship's stores, and maintenance of support vessels throughout the dockyard. However, in recent years, the Ministry of Defence decided to move the sea training base from Portland, the main reason being cost. They maintained it would be cheaper to operate from the spare capacity of an existing naval base such as Plymouth. Portland's superb strategic position in the English Channel is now about to move into a new era. The harbour is now flourishing with commerce and new industries as Portland Port.
In secret laboratories, in the shore establishment commissioned in 1924 as HMS Osprey, pioneering work was underway to develop ASTIC, sonar, and other underwater detection systems for which Portland scientists were to become famous, both before and after World War II.
The looming prospect of another conflict was driven home in 1937 when everyone had to participate in a trial blackout, and all 12,000 residents were fitted with gas masks. 2 years later, Portland Harbour was an awesome sight when hundreds of warships arrived to be prepared for war. On Sunday the 30th of June in 1940, out of the evening sun roared German planes, bombs already falling. This signalled the start of 4 terrifying years of war.
I looked out of the bedroom window and I saw these 2 German Junkers coming, skimming the top of the beach. And I thought, good God, it's Germans. You could see them so plainly. Anyhow, with that, they dived across the bank to the dockyard, and the next thing I knew, there was a pall of smoke.
The anti-aircraft ship Foil Bank was attacked whilst lying in the harbour by 20 Stuka bombers diving at her from around Verne Hill. Among the crew of 160 who went down with the blazing ship was young Jack Mantle. Although mortally wounded, he kept his gun firing to the last moment. For this incredible bravery, he was awarded the Victoria Cross. In that same raid, 10 civilians, including 4 teenagers, were killed in Castletown.
Yes, I was working for McAlpines at the time, who were digging 2 huge tunnels and which would later contain ships' fuel oil. And the reason they dug these tunnels was because that if the tanks on the Chesil Beach Road were hit, that would leave them short of oil for the ships. I was one of the civilians that was injured in the bombing of the foil bank, and I suffered a loss of memory for 10 days.
While he was in hospital, it was the Red Cross who found an injured workmate, Charlie Carr, who was able to recognize him. In August 1940, enemy raiders left a trail of destruction through Fortuneswell. Every window in the street was shattered, and ceilings and walls blown down.
This particular day, there was one terrific explosion, and it was a landmine that had landed at the back of the house on the allotments. We at that time had a worker from McAlpine's lodging with us. He wasn't afraid of the air raids at all, he said, so he sat and ate his breakfast while the rest of us were taking shelter. After it had all gone quiet, we went into the kitchen, and the McAlpine's man was under the table. All the crockery had been blown off of the dresser, just leaving the handles swinging on the hooks, and one sauce bottle stood up on the table.
Such attacks continued to bring death and destruction for another 2 years. In 1943, however, our troops saw an invasion of a different kind, that of friendly American soldiers.
Before D-Day, I do remember the Americans coming through day after day after day, because for very often I was late for school because I couldn't cross the road with the continuous convoys coming down through.
This all culminated in the great assembly of ships and craft for the attack on Fortress Europe, later known as D-Day.
Oddly enough, I was based in Plymouth really for D-Day, but 2 of us were detached and sent to Portland to be part of the American build-up for Omaha Beach, and I did 23 round trips from the beaches in Portland. I am, I believe, the only Portland chap to have left Portland on D-Day for the beaches.
Portland's part on the D-Day landings was marked by American Ambassador John G. Winant unveiling this stone in Victoria Gardens. It's incredible to think that such a vast amount of troops and vehicles passed by this very spot. When the joy of victory had subsided, Portland was left in a bleak period of food and labour shortages. But now, everyone was looking forward. Post-war recovery meant large orders of stone for the rebuilding of blitzed towns and cities, and for the 500,000 headstones for the Commonwealth war graves.
Barrow Hill, near the cliff at Southwell, was the site chosen for the largest building to be erected on Portland since the Verne Citadel. This was the Admiralty Gunnery Establishment, later called the Admiralty Underwater Weapons Establishment. Top secret scientific research was conducted here, and in 1961 this was the setting for one of the classic spy cases of all time, featuring microdots, secret maps, dead letterboxes, and documents passed to Russian agents. In an 8-day trial at the Old Bailey, it emerged that Harry Horton of White Regis and Ethel G. of Hamborough Road, Fortuneswell, were vital links in a Soviet spy chain.
The case shook the whole of the NATO alliance and led to a tightening of security around Portland. Locals could no longer wander freely around the weirs above the naval base or down to that part of the shore.
Meanwhile, the council decided to tackle the age-old problem of sea flooding at Chisholm once and for all. Contractors moved in to start on the first stage of the new sea wall in 1958. where a rapidly eroding clay bank was now all that lay between the old village and disaster. Over the next 7 years, Brandy Row and the shore at Chesil Cove were given strong protection against the might of the sea, with the added bonus of a fine promenade. The construction of the last phase of that scheme prevented vast areas of clay bank and cliffs sliding inexorably towards the sea. However, the sea wall did not extend far enough to stop the worst flooding of Chisel this century, in December 1978 and March the following year. Scenes of the destruction were flashed on TV screens around the country, and news hit the national headlines. This led to action to complete the defences for the main part of Chisel, with a £5 million wall of steel driven into the back of the beach against an enormous buried culvert. Floodwater then had to be channeled far to the north to a large ditch, as the filling of the old tidal mere had blocked the natural flood path.
It took 300 years for stone quarrying to eat into nearly a quarter of this island. It took 30 years of post-war housing development to absorb almost as much of the remaining open land.
The ancient Verne Common was the scene of the first and largest of the new estates. From 1950, much of the vast buttercup and violet-strewn hillside, a perfect natural playground for generations of children and one of the most picturesque views of the coast, was taken for building hundreds of council houses. Then, on Top Hill, through the 1960s and 70s, development pushed from across the fields at Haylands, Sweet Hill, and towards Westcliff to meet the almost insatiable demand for new housing.
Naturally, on any island, there's a limit to developments. By the 1980s, the value of conserving what remained of Portland's natural landscapes and its historic features was finally being appreciated. In recent years, local people have shown great interest in preserving the memories and the history of their island.
Few communities have had to adjust to so many centuries of dramatic change as Portland. Even fewer have, through it all, held on to so much tradition and pride.
When looking for a place to find a harbourage, I came down to the shore and looked beyond, and there I saw the horizon. Portland gives you horizons in every direction. It is wonderful. Maybe it has no trees, but what trees it has are full of birdsong. The seagulls, people complain, but they're there. They will be there. And that is something else that freedom gives me. And Portland gives me the continuity of life. That, to me, is Portland. Freedom, happiness, harmony, beauty. What more could any person ask?
As we approach the 21st century, Portland faces more extraordinary upheavals. The Royal Navy, to which the island had played hosts, finally departed. With it went all the scientific research and the enormous civilian backup which the island had helped provide. It would not be the first time that this unique community has had to muster all its resources to adapt. If its past is anything to go by, the Portland spirit will win through.